Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK. I'm joined today by news editor Siobhan Holt and senior reporter Evie Barrett. Hello to you both.
Hello, John.
This is a special episode of Beyond the Noise because we're recording just after PRWeek's Crisis Communications Conference in London. This has been a really great event looking at how different organisations have coped with various crises from a comms perspective, what some of the big trends have been, and how to respond when crises arise. We're going to talk about some of the main themes and talking points today. So first off, I really enjoyed the opening panel, which was about weathering the social media storm, and I wanted to get your views on some of the things that came from that. I think the session was a really good kind of update on some of the latest thinking about different platforms and the upsides and downsides of being on them. We had Steve Hayes, who's the Director of Corporate Affairs and Communications at the Housing Association, GSA. He was talking about how the firm went off Twitter, and he was advising other organisations to consider this as an option. The main reason, he said, was kind of lack of engagement on the site now. But as we know, Twitter has been dogged by various other problems of trolling and sort of other various controversies post Elon Musk's acquisition of it. What Steve said was there wasn't actually much backlash internally to the decision, which I was slightly surprised at. He also said the organisation is going to kind of constantly review its strategy of social media platforms and which ones it uses and so on. So I thought we could talk about this first. And obviously, we know GSA isn't the first organisation to come off Twitter, or indeed X, or indeed off all social media. Do you think this is a good idea for organisations, or could it mean they kind of miss out on a really good communications channel? What do you think?
I think it depends what their general social media strategy is. You get some brands that have a really bespoke approach for each platform and some which kind of put similar content on each platform. So I think if you're kind of trying to really approach each one in a different way, then it makes sense to maybe not put effort into X if you're not seeing engagement on it. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like that much more to kind of tailor your content a little bit, say, to what you're putting on LinkedIn, just to kind of reach that audience, because I'm sure there are people who kind of do only engage with brands through X and aren't as active on other platforms.
It sort of depends the nature of business you're in. I mean, if you're the sort of business where you can expect trolling and kind of angry posts a lot, I'm not saying you shouldn't be on it, but I think you've got to make sure you're kind of staffed to have a strategy, if not kind of make sure you respond to most of them or be prepared for some challenges there. So I often think sort of transport companies are often in the thick end of this, aren't they?
Yeah, and we know pharma is. It's a very difficult sector to be on social because you can't promote certain products in certain ways. So a lot don't use it for that reason. And I know anecdotally we've all had a discussion that we've definitely noticed some PR agencies that don't seem to be on X anymore either.
Yeah.
So there does seem to be a change in attitude. And I agree. I think there are definitely brands out there and businesses that it's very hard to be on a social media site that does seem to enjoy slightly maybe the controversy, or, you know, and for some that isn't a comfortable place to sit, I imagine.
Yeah, having said that, you know, there are some, you couldn't really imagine a kind of viral consumer stunt going, you know, becoming popular on LinkedIn, could you? It's not really. There are some things where that kind of punchiness and that kind of audience is quite appropriate. And we hear there are a lot of, you know, as we know, sort of journalists, politicos and so on, that spend a lot of time on X still. So actually, if you're trying to go for those sorts of audiences, and you can kind of put up with the with the heat of being on the platform, then, you know, perhaps it's not such a bad thing.
Yeah, and it is actually quite a good channel for audience engagement in terms of sort of, I guess, customer service in a way. We had a session today actually from Neil Bradford, who's head of comms and marketing at London Luton Airport, and he was saying when they had a fire in one of their car parks, X was a good platform for kind of alerting people to it initially, but also to kind of speak to people who had queries and concerns about it. And he said actually what they noticed immediately was sort of accounts trying to impersonate the airport and trying to get in touch with people and sort of scam them and things like that. So they had to really focus on verifying their account and making people aware of the scams. So I suppose if you're not active on X at all, then there might be a greater risk of that because people will be looking for your brand at times like that.
Yeah, although I know Wetherspoons came off social media with quite fanfare actually, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I know the comms guy there I've spoken to about it was kind of saying, we just don't really see the benefit, and the downsides outweigh the upsides. And on that point about impersonation, the advantage of not being on social media is you can say, anytime anyone claims to be Wetherspoons on social media, it's not us. Do you know what I mean? So there's less confusion if you can just put that out and say, look, these are all parody accounts or whatever it is. So
I was really shocked actually when he showed how many had impersonated them. There wasn't just 1 or 2.
If you're an airport, you probably feel like you've annoyed quite a lot of people. So there are probably quite a lot of organisations and individuals who think, actually, let's have some fun with this. These people who, led to my flight being delayed by 3 hours or whatever, regardless of whose fault that is. We do sort of have that kind of instinctive thing of like,
and we know from the news recently as well, there's definitely a growing area of people using it as an opportunity to get people's personal details as well. So it's a real challenge out there that it could become a bigger reputational risk.
The idea of cyber hacking.
Yeah.
If you're not on social media, then there's, perhaps less risk of that.
Yeah.
A few other things actually in that first session. We heard from other panelists about quite how many mini crises start on social media and then get picked up by the wider media and get set on fire, really. We also heard a lot about trolling and online criticisms, what we discussed a bit earlier on. Fee Ajay McCarthy, who's head of external comms at BTE and PlusNet, was discussing some of these challenges. Among the sort of interesting things she said was how the way the language from trolls has kind of, as she said, got more sophisticated. They do a lot of work around the Lionesses, the England and women's football team, who unfortunately get a lot of trolls, it seems. But there's probably this sense that it's almost like bullies, isn't it? You get the kind of unsophisticated bullies who use obvious kind of aggressive language, and then you get maybe the more quote unquote sophisticated ones that might just be a bit more nasty and kind of a bit more nuanced, but actually really hateful too. So that was something that I think was worth picking up on. And this question of when do you intervene if a post becomes trolling, and how you do it, and how you sort of switch from one tone of voice to another, depending on whether you're sort of, responding in a light-hearted way to a nice, friendly comment versus having to say to people, actually, this is too far, you really need to stop doing this. So, and one point actually I think is worth discussing. We had Justin Jeffries, head of media relations at ITV. He was discussing how it can be worth raising with journalists who are starting to base their stories on a small number of negative comments, making the point to those journalists that is really what they're doing, just amplifying trolls. I mean, do you think that's a good strategy? Do you think comms professionals should be firmer with journalists who do this sort of thing, who kind of take a few negative trolly comments and then make stories out of it? I mean, do you think that strategy is effectively inevitable in the kind of era of clickbait journalism? What do you think about that?
I guess reflecting on it from sort of our perspective as journalists at PRWeek, thinking about how we'd approach it, we'd sort of, obviously, like, these discussions will come up quite often, but it depends on sort of the volume of comments that you get and also who the people are who are commenting. I think if quite a well-known spokesperson comments on an issue, then that's obviously going to make it more newsworthy. I guess it's difficult in terms of the point that you made about trolls kind of getting more sophisticated and maybe might make an issue seem kind of higher profile than it actually is. But yeah, I think a story based off a few comments might be slightly unfair, but things seem to gain traction increasingly so kind of in the current environment, so it's hard to say.
It does feel like the way of the world, doesn't it? I mean, there are a number of stories about, I don't know if there was this situation around the Euros where in the one of the podcasts that he does, Gary Lineker described the England's performance as shit. I mean, in the context, he wasn't really saying that quite, but it kind of, you could interpret it as him just saying that directly. And then that was put to Harry Kane, and then it became a story in itself. So it's, in a way, you've got sort of, people go for drama, don't they? Journalists go for drama and for conflict and for strong words. And that is the culture that we have that's just been exacerbated by social media. So it does feel slightly inevitable, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think as well, going back to that, I think it also depends on the comments that are written as well. If it's a really strong quote, and as you say, from someone high profile, then that is going to get the attention of a journalist.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it, we had this last week.
Yeah, we did.
We had some comments from Jay Rayner, the Observer food critic, talking about the amount of pictures he gets from PRs and the number of follow-ups. He was using quite strong language. I mean, our view is it's very useful actually to hear from journalists, even if our readers might not necessarily like or agree with everything he says. The fact is there are a lot of journalists that think that, and we think editorially from PRWeek's point of view, it's something that we can justify as sort of useful insights into what a lot of journalists think. I guess that's quite different maybe from just people just slagging things off and being aggressive and being horrible without giving, if you like, constructive criticism.
Yeah, and also Jay Rayner didn't just say that. He did commend the great PRs that he works with.
Yeah.
His comments were a mixture. He was just saying that it is very difficult with the follow-ups, and it's a valid opinion.
Yeah.
Obviously something that we don't necessarily agree with, because we work with PRs on a regular basis, and we know that there are great ones out there. So
great. So there are obviously a lot of sessions.
Full day, guys, full day.
Full day, and what a great day. What else stood out to you both?
Well, I spoke on a panel today and interviewed 3 members of the sector, and it was on misinformation and disinformation in the age of AI, and just went through what people need to know. And it was really informative. They gave some really interesting tips. Things like how you can use AI now maybe in your crisis comms plans to ask it to predict what could go wrong with an event, and also maybe to create the Q&As that related to that. So things like PRs will create pages and pages of what could go wrong or what they could get asked about. And so it was really interesting that they were using the AI tech to do that, to save time. So I thought that was really interesting and a really good point. Was there anything, Evie, that they said that stood out to you? Because I know you sat in on that one with me.
Yeah, in that session, and it was actually said in a few sessions throughout the day, but I think it was first said here, they were really talking about how key the relationship with journalists is, especially at times of mis and disinformation. When there's kind of a big media storm and you're wanting to get the facts out there, you need to kind of have those contacts who can do that from a trusted source. I think in a different session, they were kind of discussing how obviously journalists don't work for you, so you can't control how they're going to spin the story. But if you have a strong relationship with them, then you have to kind of have faith in them to give you a fair run and kind of portray it how they want within reason.
Shows how much of it's about the long game, isn't it?
Yeah.
You could build up goodwill, you could build up good relationships, and that's always going to help when a crisis does hit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely what came out when Neil at Luton was talking about how they handled it. Within their sector, they had all the different organisations that they could go to, but he definitely said it was the press that he had really good relationships with so that he could get the messaging out.
I listened to this session. There's a real problem, a crisis comms situation last year involving Mind, the charity Mind. Talk TV were making allegations about them that were totally untrue. And apparently Talk TV didn't ask for a right of reply. And these things just came out. And it had a massive impact on Mind. A number of people kind of, getting in touch with them, a lot of criticism, and actually people saying that they were going to be stop giving them money, effectively. Wow. So this was obviously a huge problem. And what was interesting is Alex Bushell at Mind was saying that, at this point, Talk TV was a very new station. Actually, they didn't really know people there because it was so new. And it also wasn't very big and still isn't really, compared to the reach of other sort of broadcast and print media. And that meant that they didn't really get to know people, didn't really know people beforehand. So they didn't have those relationships. And it sounded like that sort of probably meant it was a bit harder to sort of get things done. Although they did get stuff done and they had managed to have an apology. And I think one of the other things that came out from that session was Alex was emphasising the point that in the apology, it's sort of about being gracious. It's about keeping to your brand. If you're a charity around mental health, then putting out a statement that's very sort of harsh and stern and so on is, even though you're totally in the right and clearly they were the victim of false reporting. It's actually worth reminding everyone about what your brand is and sticking to those kind of guidelines of being gracious. And he said that they actually in a statement after the apology, they thanked Talk TV for making the apology and made a point of kind of not hammering them effectively, but just sort of respecting that they've done it and moving on, which I think is a really interesting point, actually, because we don't often talk about what happens after a crisis and after it's sort of been resolved, because you don't want to, go to war with media generally. I mean, there might be some exceptions, but you would like to think that this would be a one-off, and then you can hopefully have a good relationship going forward and actually build a really strong relationship even off the back of this.
And also on relationship side of things, Neil at Luton Airport said as well that you also need to really focus on your team when you're going through a crisis as well, because it's really tough. And he was sort of giving that advice that, make sure you check in and support them, because it's really taxing on the whole.
Yeah. I remember hearing from another airport a while ago, quite a few years ago actually, where they emphasised this point that if there's a crisis, you've really got to kind of have, it's almost shift work really. If it's a kind of round the clock crisis that they tend to be at airports, I guess, then, making sure that people get to have proper sleep, and that, bringing in external help if you need it, and just sort of really making sure that you're looking after the well-being of your staff is paramount.
Also on my panel, what I found really interesting was the idea that if you're trying to combat misinformation and disinformation, you've got to really make sure that your spokesperson is right. One of the panelists was talking about the MMR, misinformation, disinformation around the vaccines, and they were saying that, one of the ladies in the audience was saying that there was a lot of commentary from men in suits and the people that seemed to have opposed it were mothers. And so she was suggesting that if you do have a spokesperson, you really need to think about who you're putting in front of the camera for that. And I think that's a really important message for crisis comms, to make sure that you get the right spokesperson.
Yeah, it seems obvious, doesn't it?
It
but
does.
You're right. And I guess in the heat of the moment, you might just think, that person's a good spokesperson. That person knows about the issues.
Yeah,
let's get
really
them.
Skilled in the knowledge.
Yeah,
but actually...
as often with comms, it's about the optics, isn't it, a lot of it?
Yeah, very much so. But I thought that was a really interesting point to raise that sometimes might be overlooked by PRs.
Exactly, yeah. And obviously all of this, we can talk about this now as people who aren't
in the know,
PR professionals and aren't dealing with a crisis. So, I think anyone listening this who might say, well, it's easy for you to say that and you're not in the crisis. Yeah, fair enough. I'm not sure.
We're not feeling the pressure, guys.
Yeah. But, but it's great to pick up on these tips. And this is why Crisis Comms is such a good conference to go to. Yeah. One thing that has struck me actually from this session of Crisis Comms and from previous years is quite a lot of people who deal with crises are former journalists. I don't think it's a coincidence either. So Mind's head of media and PR, Alex, who I mentioned earlier on, I mean, he was a former journalist, and he seemed very, very into the nuances of this and the sort of who to go to. He was talking about getting straight through to the news desk, which you can't always do very easily, but he obviously knows the way to do it and which buttons to press effectively. So I feel that's a sort of natural fit for people from our background, because it's our world, isn't it, really, media relations, and how to kind of get on the right side of journos like us. So yeah, I mean, is this something that we all agree that is a good background for crisis comm specialists to have been journalists?
Yeah, I mean, we also had a session today from Johnny Fordham, who's head of comms at Premiership Rugby, and he was talking about exactly that, kind of going from, he used to work for The Sun writing about sports, and now obviously in-house doing comms. And he said when he initially made that switch, it was quite strange because he's obviously engaging with all these sports journalists that he kind of knew in his previous life, but from the other side. And he said there was kind of an assumption when he first moved that he'd be really helpful to journalists, kind of getting them scoops from the inside and things like that. And he kind of said that's not how it works sort of when you switch over. He was also saying that although he tries to spend a lot of time with those journalists that he was obviously friends with in his previous role, he also tries to spend time with journalists who don't agree with Premiership Rugby all the time and are maybe sometimes quite critical, because he was saying if you get to sit down and kind of speak to them one-on-one, then a lot of the time they're more understanding and it will kind of improve things for the future.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I can't help thinking of keep your friends close. I know it's not quite like that. An enemy is probably too strong. Maybe haters is a better word.
Yeah.
Or critics is probably a fairer one. I think that's a really good point. That build up relations over time with the people in your sort of, your more supportive media and less supportive media. because when the crisis does happen, they're going to, at least you'd have thought, think twice. Because I don't know about you, but I think as a journalist, if you should give everyone the same right of reply, the same sort of treat everyone the same way.
Absolutely.
But if you know them, like inevitably human instinct is to kind of be a bit more understanding towards them.
Yeah.
And sort of take that into account. So I think that's a real kind of fundamental that been emphasised. But yeah, that whole idea of journalists going into crisis comm specialist, I do think that's a well-trodden path. And maybe they're brought out specifically for these kind of things a lot of the time, particularly if you've been on the nationals, or you've been, sort of hard news journalist, if you like. It seems to sort of make sense.
Talking of journalists turning into comms, the presenter Lee Kane is another example.
What a segue.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. And I guess we should thank Lee from Charlesby, and formerly comms director at Downing Street under Boris Johnson. So I'm guessing he's probably seen a few crises in his time.
Oh, yeah.
But it was really good to have him as the host this time. So thank you to Lee, and obviously thank you to everyone else who attended, and all of the sponsors and all of the speakers, and everyone at Haymarket for making it happen. I think it was a really really successful event. Our last event of the season. And by the season, I mean financial year for PRWeek. But also, for obvious reasons, July and August are not exactly active times for PRWeek events.
No.
While everyone jets off to wherever.
Yeah, there's summer holidays.
Or other airports. So yeah, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review wherever you access PRWeek podcasts. That's it for now. Goodbye.